chapter number 37, the Eisenhower era, 1952 through 1960. Okay, so intro, talking about President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president we'll see being elected in 52, was the right man for the right time, right? I like Ike. Ike being short for Eisenhower. And really after the war, we see the economic booms happening, and Americans just want a time of peace where they can just enjoy their newfound consumer culture. However, that's not going to be the case because we find ourselves on the front line of the Cold War, and also because we see kind of the civil rights movement start to cause unrest in the United States. All right, so section A, affluence and its anxieties. All right, so as we mentioned last chapter, this economic boom creates this huge surge in home ownership and also construction of new homes. In fact, 1/4 of the homes that were standing in 1960 had actually been built in the 1950s. And of those new homes built, about 83% are in the suburbs. So seeing that huge increase of the suburbs and a huge increase in ownership of homes due to all of those lovely federal loans. Also, we're talking about affluence, right? We see an increase in science and technology. For example, the transistor is a wonderful invention, right? This gives rise to a revolution in electronics. In the 1940s, we did see the start of computers, but these computers had thousands of miles of wiring, took up an entire room. In fact, there's a picture on 944 showing you one of these computers from the 1940s. Okay. However, we see a new corporation, for example, like IBM, are being created, new corporations like IBM, which stands for International Business Machines, and these are kind of the prototype of the new high-tech corporation. And now that we have transistors and we have silicone wiring, it makes it possible to have smaller electronics and also quicker electronics or faster electronics. So the transistor is definitely changing things around. We also see investment into research in the aerospace division. So not necessarily going to the moon yet, but the idea of airplanes. For example, Eisenhower, being the military man he is, heavily invests in the Strategic Air Command, right? SAC, Strategic Air Command, building that up. As well, we see a growth in the commercial airliners. Specifically, we see Boeing start to build kind of the first airplanes meant to be passenger liners. We see in 57 they create the 707, and this is the first large passenger jet, and it was based on SAC's, the Strategic Air Command's B-52 bomber. And then, Boeing eventually makes one of these fancy new planes for the president, and we see the first Air Force One created in 1959. Okay, and also the makeup of the workforce is changing. In 1956, this is the first year that the number of white-collar workers outnumbers the amount of blue-collar workers, right? Blue-collar workers working in factories, working on cars, working with their hands, so to speak. White-collar workers then being like in offices, that sort of thing. And also, as we mentioned last chapter, this is really an age where women make a lot of gains in the selection of jobs they can have, right? The diversity. And a lot of these jobs are called, quote-unquote, pink-collar jobs as opposed to blue-collar or white-collar jobs. Pink-collar jobs are jobs that traditionally women occupy. So, for example, being a maid, being a waitress, being a nanny, being a nurse, being a hairdresser, being a librarian, being a flight attendant. So we see a growth in pink-collar jobs as well. And once again, this is going to start to clash with this ideal role as a stay-at-home mom, right? The cult of domesticity comes again, kind of just glorifying this suburban, kind of this idyllic suburban life. We see that in a couple of TV shows, right? Ozzie and Harriet, and also Leave It to Beaver. Both these shows show kind of like that nuclear family, right? The dad that works all day, the mom that's a homemaker, and 2 kids living in the suburbs, okay? So that was still the ideal in the 1950s, but we see some tension forming, especially when women start to work outside the home in these pink colored jobs. Okay, kind of highlighting this new tension that's forming is a super uber duper famous book that's so going to be on the AP test it's not even funny. And this is called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique. And this book is written by Betty Friedan in 1963, and it's a bestseller, and really it launches the modern feminist movement. Okay, so after we got the right to vote, the feminist movement was kind of put on hold, but now in the 60s, 63, with this book, a new feminine movement is born. And in this book, The Feminine Mystique, I'm so not saying that word right, whatever, it really highlights kind of the unhappiness some homemakers are feeling. You know, they went to college, they have a degree, but perhaps they're feeling like their lives are empty, they're just bored, that sort of thing. So the book really brings that forth. Yeah. Okay, section B, consumer culture in the 50s. All right, so this section really just starts by giving you examples of the consumer culture. For example, fast food. We see the first McDonald's opening during this time in San Bernardino, California. With regards to easy credit, we see that dinner clubs, is that the right word? Yeah, dinner clubs are introducing the first plastic credit cards. We see this is when Disneyland Land opens in Anaheim, California, showing kind of this new leisure culture. You know, you have time to take vacations now, that sort of thing. And we also see a growth in the television set. In the 40s, televisions were more kind of just for the very wealthy. There was only like 6 stations. But in the 60s, we see mostly every single family will own a TV, and there's like 422 stations. So that's a huge growth, obviously, in television. Along with television, you know, we see the rise of televangelists, people like the Baptist preacher Billy Graham, also the Catholic bishop Fulton Sheen. He's actually in the process of being canonized. What? He won an Emmy. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, but television's bringing televangelists, also increase in popularity of professional sports. So instead of just thousands of people watching a game, millions of people can watch games in the comfort of their own living room, that sort of thing. And also within professional sports, we see that is kind of a sign of the times, because we see a lot of people moving west, moving south. So we also see a lot of professional teams moving to the west as well. So like the New York Giants, they moved to California/San Francisco. The Brooklyn Dodgers become the LA Dodgers at this time as well. So sports is definitely part of that consumer culture. Oh, now we get to talk about Elvis. How could you not talk about Elvis in the 50s? So Elvis was born in 1935 in Mississippi. He really bridged together kind of the African-American rhythm and blues with kind of more of the white flavor of bluegrass to form what is known as rock and roll. Yes, that is a detail that'll get you points on your AP test, and you already know about it. Crazy. Anyway, so Elvis, right? Also, we see some new figures forming, like Marilyn Monroe is becoming popular at this time, and a lot of conservatives are not very happy with this. Marilyn Monroe is the first person to grace the cover of a new magazine called Playboy. So we can see a lot of conservatives are getting upset by these changes in the culture. Yes, okay, so section C, the advent of Eisenhower. Okay, so this is when Eisenhower actually gets elected. Okay, remember in 48, right, Truman wins, a huge upset. Truman is a Republican. No, Truman is a Democrat. Totally said that wrong, of course, because he's the VP under FDR, the ultimate Democrat, which is probably not even true. But whatever, Truman is a Democrat. He had won that upset election in 58, okay? So now this is kind of talking about the 52 election, and the 52 election was not looking good for those Democrats. For one thing, Korean War was kind of in the stalemate. That wasn't very popular. Also, we saw Truman had that kind of tiff with the war hero MacArthur, and that didn't make him very popular either. And there was a lot of inflation happening after the war, because during the war we had all of those price caps, those price controls, but after the war those went away, so we see the price of goods really increasing, which is never a fun thing for the consumer. So it wasn't looking good for the Democrats. The Democrats meet and they elect, or they nominate as their candidate in the 52 election, Governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. Okay. Republicans, they get a wonderful candidate, a very popular man, the one and only General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Of course, he's our war hero. His campaign slogan is "I like Ike." Ike meaning Dwight. And he chooses as his vice president, now Senator of California, Richard Nixon, who of course grew to fame through being a communist hunter, right, a red hunter. So we have running for the Republicans, we have Eisenhower, and then as his VP, we have Nixon. So actually during the campaign, Eisenhower really doesn't actively campaign for the ticket. It's really going to be Nixon who's going to go out there and start campaigning in the 52 election. So as Nixon is campaigning, people start accusing him of accepting kind of, not bribes, but accepting illegal donations. Okay, so Nixon gives this super duper famous speech, and it's called the Checkers speech. Yes, like the board game, the Checkers speech. And what this is he goes on TV to kind of address these charges that he's taking these illegal donations. He wants to put that idea at rest. So what he does is he goes on TV and makes this kind of heartwarming speech and saying, yes, I did accept a donation, and that is our family's dog Checkers, right? The Cocker Spaniel dog Checkers. And yes, I accepted it. A guy gave me this Cocker Spaniel, but my kids love him so much and we're not going to give him back, okay? So this Checkers speech really does a lot to propel Nixon forward, kind of puts those charges that he's accepting legal donations to the side, okay? But it also goes to show the power of television, right? This is a televised speech, more or less, he gives. We also see Eisenhower make a couple appearances on TV, some TV spots, and people, some people are like, you're selling the president like you're selling toothpaste. What's going on? But we're seeing television becoming important in elections. Praise the Lord. All right. Well, it really wasn't much of a contest. Eisenhower won very easily. Eisenhower got 442 votes to Stevenson's 89. And it's really, no one ever doubted that Eisenhower was probably going to win, especially because towards the end of the election, he personally promised to go over to Korea and get things straightened out. Yes. Somewhere I am in my notes. Okay, so he's elected. So the first thing he actually does after he's elected is he goes over to Korea and spends about 3 days there trying to find a compromise, trying to make change. But nothing really happens in those 3 days. In fact, within the next 7 months, nothing really comes about. So finally, after 7 months of trying to get Korea settled finally, he kind of hints at, well, maybe the United States has to use nuclear weapons, and that does it. Just even hinting at the nuclear weapons turns things around, and they were able to come up with an armistice, sort of speak. But it was really kind of sad, because after 3 years of fighting, 52,000 Americans were killed, and more or less the border looked exactly the same as it did when the war started. Okay, so we had North Korea is communist above the 38th parallel, and the United States, and South Korea is more democratic, kind of in line with the United States. However, people said containment was the story. We contained them. They didn't, spread. So maybe the Korean War wasn't such a bad thing after all. Okay. And this section just ends by reminding you that Ike, that's what we call Eisenhower, we're that close, right? Ike was ideally suited to really help calm Americans' anxieties during the Cold War, right? He had experience, he had been a war hero, he was sincere, but also fair and optimistic, and he had this sense of being unpolitical. He didn't seem to have an agenda, and he was very, very well loved. People kind of saw him as kind of a grandfather figure, Okay? Critics say that he should have spent that popularity on a cause. If you're that popular, if you're that well liked, you should have, tried to make a positive change with that popularity. Specifically, people would wanted to see him work within the civil rights movement. But Eisenhower really wasn't that guy, right? Eisenhower just wanted things to remain calm. He didn't want to open any cans of worms. Okay. Social harmony. Okay, section D, the rise and fall of Joseph McCarthy. Ooh, we're going to talk about communists again, or the lack of, one of the two. Okay, so Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, and he was a Republican. And he was a red hunter, right, getting those communists out. So in 1950, Senator McCarthy accuses the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, of employing 205 communists knowingly. Okay. The deal was, though, McCarthy wasn't willing to provide the list of these said communists that supposedly the Secretary of State had hired. Okay. But nonetheless, the Republicans, of course, McCarthy was the Republicans were okay with this, because more or less McCarthy is attacking the Democratic Party. So the Republicans are like, okay, this is kind of weird, but we'll let you slide because you're attacking Democrats, and we'll listen to that all day long. So McCarthy got a little bit bolder. Now he's going after the former Secretary of State, General Marshall, like hashtag the guy who created the Marshall Plan. He's kind of a big dog. And what he does is he accuses Marshall of creating this immense communist conspiracy. And this sense, this McCarthyism, this kind of distrust, this kind of fear of communism really flourishes at this time because, of course, the fear of the Cold War is there as well, but also just an atmosphere of suspicion. So McCarthyism, this idea that communists might be out there, is definitely flourishing during the Cold War. And it really damages Americans' reputation internationally, right? Americans were supposed to be this fair democratic nation, but we have Senator McCarthy just kind of accusing people off his cuff without a whole lot of information or evidence backing him up. Oh, McCarthy. And many, officials, writers, actors, their careers were absolutely ruined because they're accused of being communists or being communist sympathizers. So it wasn't a good deal for a lot of people in that regard. But more or less, the public really did approve of McCarthy's, crusade. So because the people more or less approved of it, politicians were really weary of stopping MacArthur. They didn't want to lose favor within their constituents, and even worse, they didn't want to be accused themselves of communist sympathy. We call communism red. Even calling someone pink was a huge no-no, right? Even if you call someone pink, meaning kind of communism, that could absolutely ruin your political career. So a lot of people, he got away with a lot because no one wanted to be attacked to themselves. Yes, something like that. Where are we at? Communist sympathizers, Secretary of State. Okay, and also Eisenhower, although Eisenhower does not like MacArthur, Eisenhower gives him a lot of control over who is hired and fired within the State Department. Okay, so McCarthy actually fires a lot of people that he suspects to be communist sympathizers, and this is really actually a bad idea because he's firing a lot of Asian, what's the word I want? Asian specialists who knew a lot about what's going on in Asia. He fires them, and they would have been super duper valuable when it came to dealing with kind of Indochina, right? Vietnam. So had those advisors not been fired for being communist or supposedly communist, things might have looked a lot different, perhaps, in Vietnam. But that's the next chapter. Okay, so finally McCarthy, he crosses the line, and he crosses the line when he starts accusing the army of being communists. All right, so what happens is there's this big televised hearing. It's 35 days long. This is the Army MacArthur hearings. And what he does is he makes kind of a fool of himself. He goes to the army, and he's very kind of mean, very rude. People don't like that. You're not supposed to be mean to the army. But also, it kind of shows how foolish he is, right? He's accusing people, but he has no evidence to back himself up, or at least very vague pieces of evidence. So he's really kind of looking like a fool, very, very being irresponsible in his accusations, that sort of thing. So eventually, like 3 months after these hearings are over, the Senate condemned him for conduct unbecoming a member of the Senate, and he'll actually die of alcoholism just 3 years later. So the sad story of Joseph MacArthur. All right, section E, desegregating American society. So desegregating means, blending together all races, right? Getting rid of those Jim Crow laws, especially in the South. All right, so 1956, we see 15 million African American civilians. About 2/3 of those civilians still lived in the South. And Jim Crow laws were still there. Jim Crow laws being laws that segregated blacks and whites. So separate schools, separate entrances, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Those were all in full swing. And really what these did is they made African Americans economically inferior, but also kind of politically powerless. Of all of the African Americans who were eligible to vote, only 20% of those were actually registered to vote. And we also see that these African Americans are really kept in place by violence. For example, in 1955, a 14-year-old African American boy, Emmett Till, was lynched by a mob for supposedly leering at a white woman. Okay, and once again, segregation also tarnished Americans' international image. After all, we were supposed to be the beacon of freedom against those communist Soviets, but it's not very free when you see mobs of people lynching each other. Okay, but slowly we see the civil rights movement kind of start to take ground. We see Jackie Robinson being the first first African American professional baseball player signing with the Dodgers in '47. The NAACP, right, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they help win a very important Supreme Court case. That's what I meant. This is Sweet versus Painter, and in Sweet versus Painter, the Supreme Court ruled that separate professional schools, so like, where you go to get your master's degree, were unconstitutional because they failed to meet the test of equality. Because up to this time, the rule was separate but equal. So Sweat versus Painter ruled that these graduate schools were not equal, so they were unconstitutional. So allowed African Americans to go into white graduate schools or professional schools. Rosa Parks, of course, they got to mention her. She's arrested in December of 1944 for refusing to give up her seat in the white section of a Montgomery bus. This sparks the Montgomery bus boycott, of course, Montgomery being the city where this happens. And so for over a year, African Americans refused to use the buses in Montgomery. Okay, out of the Montgomery bus boycott, we see this is when Martin Luther King Jr. really takes the lead. He's leading this bus boycott. At the time, he's only 27 years old and a pastor at a Baptist church in town. And although he was actually from a prosperous Atlanta family and never really grew up around segregation that much, he still was a wonderful orator. He still had just this devotion to or passion for justice, and he really adopted kind of nonviolent principles. Okay. Getting there. Section F, Seeds of the Civil Rights Revolution. Okay, so after hearing about the lynching of some black veterans, World War II veterans in 1946, Truman decides he wants to do something about this. So we're kind of going back in time. Now we're talking about Truman in 46. Anyway, so Truman commissions a report called To Secure These Rights. And in this is where he recommends the desegregation of the armed forces. And as we recall, this really ticks off some Southern Democrats. So in the 48 election, they will kind of put forth their own candidate, Strom Thurmond, right? Those Dixiecrats. But anyway, So after Truman, however, Congress just refused to touch this issue at all. They did not pass any civil rights legislation. And when Eisenhower came to office, Eisenhower, not wanting to make waves, really didn't do a lot with civil rights, at least at first. Okay, he didn't really want to broach the issue, but we'll see he's kind of forced to as things develop later on. So we see it's actually the Supreme Court that makes some waves in the civil rights movements in the 50s. The new head of the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, former governor of California. He's very active in addressing kind of some taboo social issues like civil rights. There are actually signs appeared along nation's highways that said, impeach Earl Warren, because he was a very controversial figure. He's making a lot of waves. Huge Supreme Court case, right? It was a unanimous, can't say that word right, decision. So everyone agreed on this in the Supreme Court. This is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Once again, something that's almost guaranteed to be on your AP test. Brown versus the Board of Education, as it's called. This comes out in May of 1954, and what this says is that the segregation of schools is unconstitutional. Okay, so this is overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson case that had been around since the 1890s that said separate but equal's okay. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education saying, never mind, separate but equal is absolutely a bad idea. So, the South, not super happy about this court decision. And in the court decision, the idea is that desegregation of schools has to go forth with, quote, all deliberate speed. So not very specific. So we see the South dragging their feet like nobody's business when it comes to desegregating the schools. So much so that we see about 100 congressmen from the South sign something called, wait for it, the Declaration of Constitutional Principles. And like I said, about 100 congressmen signed this declaration in 1956. And what this declaration is saying that we are pledging to be unyielding in our resistance to desegregation. So trying everything they can to make sure desegregation does not happen in the South. So even 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, we see only about 2% of African Americans actually be in quote-unquote white schools. So desegregation really slow moving in the South. All deliberate speed apparently does not mean quickly. All right, so like I said, Eisenhower didn't really want to deal with this issue, but as the president, you kind of have to deal with stuff you don't want to. Okay, so this happens when in 1950-something, wait for it, 1957, in an attempt to desegregate a school, Little Rock, Arkansas Central School, there were 9 African Americans who were going to start attending, like I said, Little Rock's Central High School. Okay, so the governor of Arkansas, he actually mobilizes the National Guard to prevent these 9 black students from going or attending the Little Rock Central High School. So, obviously, this governor is going against the Constitution, going against the board, Brown versus the Board of Education. So Eisenhower's forced to step in. So Eisenhower actually sends federal troops down there to help escort these 9 African Americans to school. Okay. Other things Eisenhower does is he signs the first civil rights bill we have seen since right after the Civil War during that Reconstruction era. And he promises the Southern senators that although he's signing this, this is the mildest civil rights bill possible. So he's still like kind of, this isn't his issue, he's just doing this because it's his job, that sort of thing, that sort of idea. Very mild civil rights bill. And what this civil rights bill did is it set up a civil rights commission. All right, so the Civil Rights Commission is a group of people that are supposed to ensure that, or supposed to investigate, I should say, violations of civil rights and also protect voting rights of the African Americans. So he sets up this, signs a civil rights bill that sets up this commission that helps protect voting rights. Okay, but African Americans, are working away too. We talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, and we see that Martin Luther King Jr. really comes to prominence because of that. So he continues forth. He creates something called the SCLC. Let me just say what it stands for. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the SCLC is set up in 1957, and this was supposed to mobilize black churches towards the civil rights movement, which was obviously a very good idea because it's really the black churches that were the most established, right? Blacks in the South had really been prevented from doing a lot of things, but they were allowed to go to church. They allowed these black communities, church communities, to flourish. So he goes to the churches to mobilize for the civil rights movement. Okay. Also during this time, we see something called the SitIn Movement. And this starts in February of 1960. 4 college freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina, demand service at a whites-only Woolworth's lunch counter. So they go to the lunch counter, they sit down. This is a white lunch counter. They sit down and demand service. Okay. Well, the waitress, who happens to be an African American, refuses to serve them. So they stay there till the store closes or whatever. They come back the next day. Now, instead of 4, there's 19. Still no service. They come back the next day with 85. By the end of the week, they had 1,000 college students at the sit-in. And so we see the sit-in movement really spread throughout the South. So also students get organized, kind of organize these movements, and the student organization is at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Helped kind of focus the efforts of college students. Okay, with that, we are done continuing on with Eisenhower. We'll get to Vietnam in this chapter as well, so a lot more to come.